All online games have toxicity. To what degree is up to the game. Some games have known to have really great communities, while other games have known to have the incredibly most salty communities you can imagine. With that being said, MMOs in general have been known to have incredible levels of toxicity when it comes to top tier content. Most games like World of Warcraft basically bake their DNA into very challenging content and were known to be quite elite from the get-go. Now all MMOs, whether it's Final Fantasy, Guild Wars, World of Warcraft, they all have a level of toxicity and elitism as you get higher into harder tier content. And that is expected. You can't imagine that the top tier content is something that everybody can do. So as content gets more challenging, obviously there's barriers to entry. Before we get further into that, I just wanted to say that all MMOs in general need a complete aspect of player base. You don't need to play an MMO and do dungeon content or raid content to enjoy the MMO. A lot of players just like leveling, they like the gathering aspects, they like the social aspects, the ERP aspects, as well as just the easier dungeon content that could be available. And I would argue that this is the most important. We all play games to enjoy them to a degree. Sometimes we do like to challenge ourselves, but every single player challenges themselves in different ways. In this video, I want to have a look at metagaming versus toxicity and try to figure out where in MMOs we stand between the two. First things first, when you start a new MMO or come back to an MMO like me so many times, what is the first thing you usually do? Well, usually I would head to either Wowhead or Snow Crows or some sort of Final Fantasy tier list to have a look at what the meta DPS or healer or tank is, so I can decide what I want to play and build towards. Now this is normal for a lot of players that like to do raids and dungeons. This is basically looking for the meta. Now, what does the word meta mean? Well, it's changed a lot of meaning from its original Greek roots. In Greek, meta is afterwards. So the kind of concept behind the word and the way it's kind of morphed in online gaming is it's the best build or classes to get after or through the content. So that means that usually the tank's DPS tier list that you would look at is basically when you play these classes, you will be able to do dungeon or raid content as easily and as comfortably as possible. But we have to think about what that really means. Now in this scenario, an example, I'm going to use World of Warcraft and also Guild Wars 2 as my framework because those are the two I'm pretty much most familiar with at the moment. When it comes to a game like Guild Wars 2, if you look at the guides from Snow Crows, you have to keep in mind that they are technically a speedrunning guild. They are doing bosses in the quickest amount of time as possible. So if you are looking at their tier lists and things like that or their recommendations, you're basically looking for the quickest kills, not the most comfortable kills. That means that generally your tanks and your healers are pumping the most amount of DPS because the more DPS you do, generally the less mechanics you will see. And very similarly, if you look at Wowhead or Icy Veins, they will generally recommend extremely high damage dealing healers and tanks, which is why at this current point when recording, Disc Priest as well as the Demon Hunter tank are generally the S tier choices because they do the job and they do a lot of DPS. But that doesn't necessarily mean they are the best tank and healer in terms of output and comfort of a run. But in general, what I'm trying to get at is if you want to do the hardest content, i.e. 15 plus keys going into 20, or if you want to do challenge mode raiding in Guild Wars and you want to do as many skips as possible, these are the classes that they recommend, the tiers. They will not necessarily be the most comfortable classes for a run. A good example of this in Guild Wars 2, if you do challenge mode fractals, which is slightly akin to mythic dungeons in WoW, when you do your challenge mode fractals, Shattered Observatory and Nightmare, generally power damage is preferred. A lot of people will actually leave or be upset if you play a condition class. Now, condition classes will be able to do the content, but because of the ramp up time, they don't skip as many mechanics, meaning that you might see extra mechanics. This obviously puts a lot more pressure on your healer and your support, as they might have to deal and heal through more mechanics. Now obviously if you all play power classes, chances are you can burst down a lot of bosses before you see mechanics. Very similarly to World of Warcraft Mythics, generally when you do 20 plus keys, you're going to need healers and tanks that do more DPS so that you can make the DPS checks and the time checks on your keys. Now the question is it toxic for players to look for certain classes or certain group makeups when doing these higher tier content, i.e., 18 plus keys in WoW, or doing challenge mode fractals in Guild Wars? And I would kind of argue no. I would say that if you are a player to the degree that does that kind of content, you will probably have the right classes or the right makeup because you understand why you need to play that certain way. However, where the toxicity does come into is when you get players playing lower tier content, but they have the expectation of higher tier content, i.e. if there's people just doing tier 4 fractals in Guild Wars or doing, below 15 keys, and they won't take something like an affliction lock because they think to themselves, well, if you're not playing demonology, you don't know how to play the class, you're playing the wrong class. I would argue that this is where the toxicity and bad MMO community aspects come into play. It is something that I think most MMOs need to kind of address, but generally it's up to the player base themselves. We have been conditioned in MMOs to think of it as this run takes 30 minutes or an hour. I don't want to sit here and wipe over and over again because they don't have the DPS output, they don't have the healing output, they're not playing the right tank, this isn't the right group makeup. And that's kind of a sad part that MMOs have gotten to in the last while. Now when it comes to top tier content, obviously the player and the class knowledge is more important than playing the meta class. I've seen people play Beast Mastery Hunter and do absolutely horrible DPS, and I've seen classes that are supposed to be C or D tier rated out DPS everybody else. The class knowledge and knowing the fight knowledge is way more important. Obviously top tier players know this, they don't care what they're playing, they've been playing the class for so many patches, they know exactly how to get the best DPS. The amount of times in Guild Wars that I would go into a raid and see a class that I'd never seen before, like in the old days where Condition Reaper was a meme and you would get someone walk in but you knew the player was a top tier player and you would see them do crazy DPS compared to everybody else. You know that every class has the ability to pop off, and also metas will change. You can't end up being a meta chaser. Now obviously if you are one of those people that is top tier, challenge mode fractals, challenge mode raider, or in World of Warcraft kind of case, you're doing mythic raids, high key mythic dungeons, things like this, obviously you will realize what needs to be done to get that content done. But when it comes to this lower tier content, MMO communities in general need to realize that there is this play. You're not going to need to play this S tier class because you might play it absolutely horribly. An example of this in a personal confession, I've been playing Discipline Priest in retail WoW on some mythics, and I'm playing it not because it's the S tier healer, but because I've been playing it in Wrath Classic as well as SOD Classic, and I just love Disc Priest in general. I've been struggling just because of trying to understand how the class plays in retail compared to the classic versions, and I know that if I switch to Holy Priest, I would be having a much easier, more comfortable time because of the way the class plays. So the point of the example is I'm taking an S tier healer and playing it like a douchebag, where if I just took myself and played Holy Priest or something else, I would probably be having a much better time and pushing towards obviously like 15, 16 key rather than struggling to heal my 7s and 8s. But my stubbornness obviously and wanting to play Disc Priest is what's keeping me there, not because it's an S tier healer. And that's what you see often. You see people play classes that are supposed to be S tier, but they don't understand how and why they play those classes and how to get the best utility out of them. Now when you look at metagaming and high tier content in general, you also have to look at a concept called role compression. Role compression basically means if you can have one class doing multiple things, healing, buffing, and doing other things, that allows everybody else to not have to do that. That is also generally why certain class makeups and metas are required. In the case of Guild Wars, if you can allow your healers to do as much mechanics and whatevers as possible, that allows DPS to just DPS. And when it comes to World of Warcraft and other games, if you can have one class doing certain things, bringing certain buffs that allows the group to do DPS, you'll obviously want that specific spread every time. Now, this isn't as bad of a problem in retail, but when it comes to classic and also SOD, you're going to want certain class makeups as well as also certain armor groups. A lot of people don't want to have to roll against other cloth users, or as you stack certain amounts of one class, they become redundant, i.e. in the case of hunters, obviously if you're using the Scorpid pet, only one pet is going to allow its dot to be put on at a time. So if you have two hunters, it's not really going to give you any benefit. So this means that you're going to run up to a thing where there are metas, but there's going to be a lot of people competing for those spots, and that's quite tough, where you have to compete against someone who maybe puts so much effort and doesn't have a job and just plays the game over and over again, and you're going to have to try compete against that kind of DPS or gearing, and that just makes the game tougher to get into and to play at higher tiers. And that's pretty much all I wanted to really say. I just think, you know, as a player, you'll always know that the higher the tier of content you get into, the more elite it's going to be. The more people are going to expect certain things. Oh, you got all the buffs, all the food, all the utilities, things like that. Do you play the right classes? I think if obviously, if there's any person who watches this and is kind of trapped in that meta mentality, try and see past numbers. Don't just see people as a mythic score or a kill proof score or something like that. People can obviously surprise. Give it a shot. If MMO communities in general can just be like, you know what, let's give this guy a shot. Let's, you know, see what he's about and whatever. Yeah, it's going to be a scuff run instead of doing it in 30 minutes or whatever. This might take a little bit longer. So yeah, I really hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and subscribe would be awesome. If you didn't enjoy it, thank you so much for watching anyway. Hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.